Hey guys, Doterian here, back with another quick Last Epoch video on crafting experimental affixes. You can get experimental affixes from exiled mages, which are like mini bosses that you can find on the map. You need to break them out of their rune prism and defeat them in order to get the loot and the runes associated with experimental affixes. These affixes are very niche items. You can see all of these experimental affix items have a slash through it with a blue affix. This blue affix is the experimental affix. Generally, you tend to get things associated with traversal skills, ward, or potion use. Depending on your build, they can be extremely game-changing. So for instance, currently ward-based and low-life builds tend to be very popular as of late, especially for climbing high corruption, and this is because ward is just too strong of a stat. It's currently because there's no cap on ward at the moment. Some builds are literally building hundreds and thousands of ward on their build. But that aside, if you look at this particular gloves, you can see this experimental affix says 8% of current health lost per second. To compensate that, you get 8% of your missing health as ward per second. This particular build is extremely useful for experimental affixes being used in a low life build. So anyway, once you defeat exile mages, they're going to drop loot that has experimental affixes on it, or they will drop a rune of research. Now, rune of research you can see as a crafting material. I have 71 of them. You'll find a lot of these as you defeat exile mages. The rune of research seals an experimental affix on the item. The affix is moved into its own slot, leaving its old slot open for you to add a new affix. This particular affix works exactly like a Glyph of Despair, which is this one here. Glyph of Despair has a chance to seal an affix onto the item, moves it out of its own slot, leaving its old slot open for you to put another affix in. In this case, Rune of Research is extremely good because it will guaranteed seal the experimental affix. Now, the item can only have a maximum of one sealed affix on it, so you can't like use the Rune of Research and then use a Glyph of Despair. You need to just use one or the other. In this case, for these particular items, you can see here I've got all of these experimental items. I can put them into my crafting area, and I can use the Rune of Research to seal an affix. Once I seal the affix, it gives you a chance to give you a Glyph of Insight. When the experimental affix is sealed, you have a chance to gain Glyph of Insight. This is higher for items with higher tier affixes but cannot exceed 45%. So now that I've got my Glyph of Insight, once I use the Rune of Research, you can see that my experimental affix, which was previously on the gear, is now sealed. This opens up a new affix slot for me to put in a much desired slot. Or if the experimental affix wasn't something I wanted on the item, it's essentially sealing it so that I can put something else I want onto this particular item. So you can see how the Rune of Research is a very powerful crafting tool. Now moving on to the Glyph of Insight. So a lot of people aren't aware, but the only way you can get a Glyph of Insight is by sealing experimental affixes onto your gear. So once you seal experimental affixes, you have a chance to get a Glyph of Insight. And what does the Glyph of Insight do? Well, it will change a prefix into an experimental prefix. Now it says it only works on glove, boots, and belts, and does not work if the item already has an experimental affix. And with these particular items, you can see these items only have one experimental affix on it, because you can only get a maximum of one. You'll also find that these experimental items only come in boots, gloves, and belts as well. So according to what it's saying here, it only works on boots, gloves, and belts, and can only have one. That's because the experimental items can only be on gloves, boots, and belts, and also can only ever have one affix. Now it says the exact experimental affix it becomes, and its tiers are determined by the properties of the item. So that means that this is not exactly random. There is an exact science to how and what experiment affix you can get onto your gear. Now, before I go into this a bit further, I want to shout out the content creator Rax on his very helpful video on how to target experimental affixes. I'll leave a link to his video in the description down below. But essentially, we're going to be going through the science of how this works. So essentially, we have Tunk Labs. Tunk Labs has a section in it called Glyph of Insight. This is basically a Glyph of Insight simulator. So this tells you exactly what prefixes you can target to get the desired experimental affix. In the case of gloves, belts, and boots, each of these gear pieces will have a different way of achieving the desired experimental affix. So in this case, for example, with gloves, the experimental affix type is determined by total affix tiers. So what this means is currently you can choose on your item. So the item properties is represented here. You have 2 prefixes, 2 suffixes, and 1 sealed. So it says here the total affixes is determined by total affix tiers. In this case, we have a sealed tier 2. In this case, we have a tier 3, tier 1, tier 1. We have no affix here, and we've got a sealed tier 2. So let's pick tier 2, tier 3, tier 1, and none. So let's say for this particular suffix, actually it's not a suffix, this is a prefix. Let's change this to 1, let's change this to no. Okay, so let's say for this particular prefix, we want this prefix to change into an experimental affix. Here it tells you exactly what tier the desired affix will change into. So for instance, if I select Glyph of Insight here, and just select any old affix, this particular affix will turn into this particular experimental affix if this wasn't sealed. So if this was a sealed different affix, non-experimental affix, this prefix will change into this affix. And this is for gloves specifically. For belts, belts have a different way of determining how to get your desired experimental affix on it. Now, again, with gloves, belts, and boots, each of these have different experimental affixes that you can get. So for example, the ones on boots will be completely different to the experimental affixes you can get on gloves. So make sure that if you want to find out which experimental affixes are on your gear, you can kind of just click on each one and it'll tell you exactly what one that you're going to get. Okay, so just to recap again, Rune of Research seals an experimental affix onto the gear. It moves the affix onto its own slot, sealing into the item and opening up its old slot so that you can put a new affix on there, whether or not you want to get rid of the experimental affix or put a new desired affix onto it. So Rune of Research is a very powerful tool. Glyph of Insight, on the other hand, will change a prefix into an experimental prefix, and it's not random. You can actually calculate what experimental affix you want to get onto the gear. If you found this video helpful, drop me a like down below, comment on the video, and subscribe to the channel. As always, have an awesome day. Bye for now.